So, better late than never, I painted Brutogg, the ogre from the Cursed City board game, and made a detailed video of the whole process of me painting it. Some mistakes were made. The footage is mostly mirrored horizontally. I could probably do something about that, but you'll just have to manage, okay? So yeah. So I'm starting out by dry brushing all the metal parts with Games Workshop lead belcher. I decided to undercoat this miniature black since there's quite a lot of metal surfaces on the miniature, which makes black a pretty good color for shading it. And it's also good since I want a pretty dark, scary vibe for this scary ogre. I decided to leave this part without any glue or unbuilt because it makes things a little bit easier, and it's really not much of a hassle to just pop it off and put it back on again. So I'm dry brushing the chainmail and the scale mail areas. Don't really have to worry about being too neat because we're gonna paint over the areas where we get unwanted lead belcher anyway. So we're dry brushing to get a nice worn look. I imagine Brutogg doesn't really take care of his weapons and armor more than necessary. Next up we'll be painting some little metal details like the belt buckle and shoulder guard trim section with, well, I'm using Games Workshop Balthasar Gold, and which is really more of a bronze color. If I want to paint gold, I wouldn't use this color really, but it works well for our purposes when it comes to painting these bronze sections. And I'm doing the metals first because there are quite a lot of metals on this miniature and it can get a little messy, especially if you want to do dry brushing like we did. Also, I'm leaving the studs on the leather belt parts for later. I'll paint those after painting the actual leather sections. So I'll paint this shoulder trim and this little vial. I dry brushed them steel, but decided that I would like them to be bronze instead. I now decided to paint the mace bronze too. Next up, we'll be using some Games Workshop Retributer Armor to paint a few gold areas, like this little ornamentation over here. And stripe on the ogre's helmet, like this line going horizontally across it. Maybe these little rings as well. The ornament on the back. Might need 2 layers here. And then also this little jewel, she's got hanging from this necklace. And with that dry, we'll be doing a dark brown wash of Games Workshop Argrax Earthshade over all the steel and bronze areas. We'll later add some verdigris as well to the bronze areas. Maybe some of the steel areas too. We'll see. I'm using brown here because I want the steel to have a dirty, slightly rusty look. We're not washing the gold areas with this though. I prefer to use like a warmer wash, like a flesh wash, Raglan Flesh Shade for that, to give the gold a warmer feel. But brown wash works fine too. We're then dry brushing the chainmail with Games Workshop Iron Breaker, which is basically like a medium bright steel color to give some shine back to the chainmail parts. Could also dry brush the scales if you want to. I'm thinking I'll edge highlight them. Dry brushing the blade just a little bit, focusing on the sharp part, keeping the rest of the blade dark. And then just a little edge dry brush on the back of the blade. I'll just dry brush the helmet a little bit too. Dry brushing is a good technique. It's not just a cheap way out to do something quickly. In a lot of cases, it's just a very good technique. At least in some textures and rough materials. So that looks pretty good. And we're trying to leave some darkness on the chainmail where the light wouldn't hit from above to create some depth. Gonna dry brush the knee pad a little bit as well, focusing on the uppermost part since the other part will be in shadow. I'll then do a very light dry brush of mithril silver, runefang steel, I think. No, stormhost silver is the most up-to-date Games Workshop paint, but yeah, like any bright silver. And we'll do this in a few select places, like where the light would hit. And if you got trouble with where the light would hit the miniature, just like look at it from above and mostly above, and you should see which areas that the sun would reach. I'll then do a dry brushed highlight of Games Workshop Brass Scorpion, basically like medium brass color on the mace. Gonna dry brush all of it, which will brighten it up a bit. And could also dry brush the belt buckles a little bit, I guess. We'll do some layered highlights on this. I then created a little verdigris wash by mixing some glaze medium with a bit of Games Workshop Sotic green and a tiny bit of white paint. You can do this with water, but glaze medium kind of helps with the consistency and the flow of the color. If you're used to just using Games Workshop paints, it's basically just use Lamy medium. Contrast medium probably works too. And we'll gently push this wash into the like the bases of the spikes of the mace. That's where we want them. And like on the box, we're not gonna paint this entirely like the box art, but kind of like the look of how they made parts of the helmet have verdigris, so like this line here and the lower trim of the helmet too. Maybe a little bit on the blade too. Look cool. Like we can do some steel in with some orange rust wash and maybe some parts with like this turquoise verdigris look, which is pretty cool. Gives some variation to the paint job, and it just looks interesting. Gives some contrast as well. Dabbing a little bit onto the belt buckles as well. Maybe on the knee pad. Now we're doing some highlights with Games Workshop Rune Lord Brass. Yes, kitty, we are. And it's a very bright brass color, basically. So we're highlighting the bronze, brass, whatever areas, focusing on edges and raised areas. Painting this shoulder trim, dragging the brush gently along the edge to highlight it. The blade attachments, and we're going to highlight the spikes of the mace as well. So we've got a pretty cool verdigris effect on the mace, and we're going to do some highlights like in seen from above, in kind of thin lines in the middle of the spikes of the club or mace. We're also doing like a few little scratches and dots in the areas between the spikes. And the lower spikes, I simply highlight them from the side, like from where the light would hit. I then shade the gold areas with a little bit of flesh shade. Right-line flesh shade from Games Workshop. I'm now going to be doing a fine silver highlight over all of the armor plates and, well, basically every metal part that isn't chainmail, because we've already highlighted that with a bright silver. So I'm gonna hit all the edges, and it's gonna be time consuming, but it's going to be worth it. You can of course skip this if you want a simpler paint job, and it'll look just fine. But yeah, we're gonna paint all the scale edges like that, and highlight the gold as well. You can of course do like an in-between highlight of a brighter gold, but I'm gonna skip that now. Right, this in the middle is supposed to be a gem. I accidentally highlighted that. I'm gonna paint that some cool color later. But yeah, the brass or bronze gets another highlight, just the brightest one. And I'm also going to be doing some scratches, like if you see this detail on the knee pad, there are these light scratches which I'm going to try and make a little bit more obvious, painting thin lines like this. Maybe just a few spots like that. And the good old edge highlight. Makes the surface a little bit more interesting. I'm gonna do the same with the helmet. You see there's a dent here. Yeah, no kitty. Food is the best, but you gotta wait. Yeah, you gotta wait a little bit more. So we're highlighting like the lower part of these little dents, because that is where the light would hit if light came from above. The blade will be highlighted with the same bright silver in thin little lines. Okay, these aren't as thin as I would have liked, but I can tidy that up. Some of the lines will be shorter, some will be longer. People aren't really gonna look at the model from below probably, but I'm doing some highlighting here anyway. And then we'll do a little edge highlight, silver. Like that. The lines didn't really end up as pointy as I would have liked, so I'm gonna use some darkened down silver to like sharpen those edges pretty much. Starting to look better. Could also do like a dotted little highlight around here to mark out where the blade edge starts. Maybe add a little bit of black near to it for some contrast. Just gonna rub it out a little bit. And then paint more black near the end for a quick and easy blend effect, really. Our next step is to paint the skin, and we are doing this with Games Workshop Bagman's Glow. All these weird paint names. We then do a flesh wash all over the skin areas. I'm doing this with Brightland Flesh. Doing this to give a bit of shading. You really don't need to shade with washes, but it can help. It has its benefits and it also has its flaws, but I tend to use it for metals and skin. That just works for me, I guess. So we are applying it all over the skin areas, and just making sure that it doesn't pool too much in any area. there is an argument against using washes because they tint the base coat you use, or the colors you use them on, and then if you make a mistake later, if you have to correct something, it's not very easy to get that same color, since the base coat has been altered by the tint of the wash. But I think it's a good tool a lot of the time. We're now reapplying some Bugman's Glow onto the skin, leaving some of that flesh wash showing in the recesses. So you want to hit all these raised areas, like the cheekbones, the nostrils, front part of the nose, the upper lip, and eyebrows. This will later be highlighted further by mixing in lighter tones. Painting the lips as well. We'll add some red glaze to that later, I'm thinking. So we're quite liberal with this reapplying of the base coat, hitting these muscles and just leaving a little bit of that darker shade in the recesses, but also like underneath the arm. With that stage complete, I'm adding some rosy skin to the mix, a paint from Reaper, which I really like, and it's about 60-40 mix of Bugman's Glow and rosy skin, I would say. And we are going over all those areas of the skin again, leaving just a little bit of the previous stage showing, gradually building up the highlights. Looking at the muscles, you want to focus on the upper parts of them, leaving a little bit of Bugman's Glow above and below, with the thickest part being the one below. So we are sort of trying to simulate light striking the muscles from below, or hitting them. We'll then do a highlight of pure rosy skin, trying to continually leave less and less of the previous layers. So we're doing thinner and thinner lines to try and get a nice gradation, like a gradual transition of color. Just doing a few dots on the chin, the lip, and like lines on the knuckles. And we'll keep going over the muscles to continue working on our highlights. Sometimes it'll be easier to flip the model over a little bit. So we're doing thin highlights of the muscle, trying to leave the previous mix showing on either side, whilst also making sure the highlight focuses from above, so to speak. Oops, that got a little thick. I want to correct that later. Can be a little bit of a challenge to paint muscles on a larger miniature like this, because you get these pretty large flat areas, and you can of course do blending techniques to make these transitions as smooth as possible. And the highlights are coming out a little bit harsh, so we might actually just add a tiny bit of Black Moon's Glow back. And so after deciding that there was too big of a leap between those mixes, the Bagman's Glow plus Rosy Skin mix and the pure Rosy Skin, I made a little mix in between them and decided to use thin layers of that to like paint between the two highlights, and sometimes on top of them with very watered down layers to like bring them together a little bit. There are several ways to blend. There's like wet blending, two brush blending, etc. We're just doing layering, and it's not gonna get super smooth, but it's gonna read as pretty smooth anyway. It looks pretty good, I'd say. Smack the lamp there a little bit. Now, if you've practiced two brush blending or wet blending, etc., and it might become like a very efficient way to make really nice, lovely blends. But good old regular layering gives very good results too. You can also go ahead and like glaze this for ages to make it all smooth, but that just takes a lot of time. Make tiny little dots of highlights on the nose tip, the nostrils, the cheekbones, the eyebrow and the upper lip. Again, some on the lower lip. Then this guy's got a curved face. And we're gonna try and do as thin of lines as we can on the knuckles. Still not entirely used to painting with a camera in my face, but getting there. There we go, and we'll make try and make really thin lines in the middle of the past rosy skin highlights, like as thin of a line as you can. You can break it up by like making the line a little dotted like that if you want to. Makes it look a little more like a sweaty glow sort of, I think. And knowing where to place these highlights can be a little rough. Might be difficult, but like any raised parts or sharp parts, you can always just do an awkward like Google search of athletic bodies, I guess, to study those muscles. We're doing some lines here beneath the elbow because the skin will be wrinkled since it's drawn together. Elbows are often a little wrinkly. You might have noticed. I now decided to paint Brutogg's tongue, and I'm doing this with some corn red from Games Workshop mixed with a little bit of Bagman Glow. And okay, that turned out a little bit too red. So mixing a little bit more skin into it. Or I mean, this guy eats corpses all the time, so a little bit of red in its mouth Pretty reasonable, right? Also gonna paint his teeth, and I'm just using like some yellowish khaki color I have lying around in my paint palette, but if I'd use a paint pot, I'd probably use Rakarth Flesh, which is a nice color, and it looks pretty much like the mix I got here. We don't want this ogre's teeth to look too healthy, do we? I don't think. I mean, maybe that's horrible of me, but I'm kind of assuming he's not brushing his teeth a lot. Also grabbing a little bit of that reddish pink mix I used for the tongue and mixed with water. I'm gonna add it to the nose for a little bit of color. We often have a little bit more red in our skin, like on the nose and the cheeks. If it goes too dark, you can always re-highlight. I'm also using it to paint the lips, so like a translucent layer of this pink color across the lips. Yeah, it darkened the face down a little bit, so I'm going back over it to just a thin line of rosy highlight. Tiny dots. Oops. Tiny dots on the nose and yeah. And on the lip to suggest that they're a little shiny. Yeah. And now we want to give him eyes so that he can see. You don't need to use the brightest of whites, but you can if you want to. I mean, eyes aren't the brightest of white, but I mean, it kind of pops if you use that, so do whatever you like. I'm using an off-white here, just any white mixed with like a little bit of grey. Next, I decided to paint the grinning, leering face of the shoulder pad, which is almost, well, it looks pretty demonic. And I'm painting this with Games Workshop Corn Red, leaving some of the black showing like in the recesses, the crevices, and where my red area meets the like metal trim. We're then hitting those raised areas of the leering face with some Games Workshop was like a red to highlight it. Applying some of the same thoughts as when we painted Brutogg's face, because, well, this miniature kind of has two faces. One of them is just huge and red. So we're focusing on the raised areas, cheekbones, lips, chin, nostrils, bridge of the nose, etc. I decided to paint the teeth and eyes red as well, as if they're the same material. Might change my mind and like, I don't know, paint the eyes white or something later. We'll see. I'm then adding some rosy skin actually to the Warhammer red paint to make even brighter highlights. And I often use like Caucasianish skin tones to highlight red because it strikes a balance between a pink and an orange highlight. This actually goes a little bit more to the pink way of things. But yeah, it's easy to make red look pink or orange when you highlight it. The important thing to think about is to leave a lot of red showing. If you make too thick highlights, they'll just take over and it won't read as red anymore. If this happens, give it a red glaze or a red tint, like some thin red paint over those areas to make it look red again. Then adding some rosy highlight to the Warhammer red, will do some tiny bright highlights. I want this material to look as if it's a little bit shiny, so I'm trying to do really thin lines in the middle of the past highlight. And I see that I missed highlighting the one part of the upper lip, but I'll get to that. Maybe the bottom of the mouth like that. We're now base coating the leather areas, such as the belt, and the boots with Games Workshop Ryox hide. I think I'm also going to throw this onto the furry areas. Yeah, I'll do that. I like Ryox hide because it's a nice dark chocolate brown. Also gonna paint this on the pouches, and I don't mind if it doesn't really hit in the crevices because we can use that black as a shadow. Also painting these straps brown. Oh, maybe that wasn't a strap. We'll highlight these leather areas using some Mornfang brown, and I like to do this if I want the leather to look like a bit worn. I like to do this with little dots instead of lines. To make the surface look all ragged and worn. We'll also highlight the spike on the shoulder guard by painting these kind of thick lines, leaving some of that rhinox hide showing as jagged shapes. It's okay if this is a little bit uneven. So yeah, we can also actually highlight this sort of rope necklace, little dots of Mournfang brown. And then just continue making these rough but not too fat highlights on the leather parts. And for the boots, which are larger leather areas, I'll actually do a mix of rhinox hide and Mournfang brown first, and sort of make these almost blotchy little highlights along the edges and raised areas, and after that do that Mournfang brown spotted highlight. This is because I feel like you need a bit more of a gradual transition on such big leather areas as the boots. Adding Ushabti bone or Vallejo bone white to the Mournfang brown, we can then do some final little highlights. This is pretty optional, I'd say, but if you want the leather to pop just a little bit more, you can use this to make some even lighter scratches. I made some of them a little bit too big here, I think, but yeah, try and keep them small. Makes the leather pop more. Also, we are going to use this mix to continue painting this spike, which I'm painting as bone, and we'll do lines like this, leaving Mournfang brown showing. If it's a little uneven, that's fine. It's supposed to be like an organic material. It's not gonna be perfect. We're then doing another highlight of pure bone to onto this spike here. Trying to leave the previous mix showing. Just focusing on the top here. Next we're painting the fur, like the strands of hair from the fur in Steel Legion Drab or some other suitable khaki color. You could of course also do grey fur or whichever color you like. You could dry brush this or overbrush it in parts. Overbrushing is where you don't dry the paint off your brush, but you gently drag it across a textured area, like the fur, and it catches onto the raised areas like this, if it's textured well enough. It's not as messy as dry brushing, and it gives less of a chalky look. We're now highlighting the trousers with a mix of standard grey, mechanical standard grey that is, from Games Workshop, and a little bit of black. And we'll then follow it up by highlight of pure standard grey. And I'm again doing like little scratches, because I want it to look like a very rough fabric on some very worn trousers. I'm going to paint the other leg yellow because I wanted to match the Free Guild or Empire army that I've got going on the back burner. So we're highlighting this with some pure mechanical standard grey, and also this will be used to highlight the edges of the jacket. They're really thin, so I didn't bother with the last highlight on that. This is then being highlighted further by adding a little bit of white to the standard grey. Again, doing little dotted highlights on the trousers. Sorry, just keep the camera there for a little bit. And little highlights on like prominent parts of the jacket, like here for example. I decided to paint the wood of the mace in the same colors as the fur. So Steel Agent Drab from Games Workshop, and I'm doing like these thin lines to make a nice wood effect. We'll then add some white or light khaki to highlight this and the fur. I base coated the other trouser leg in Games Workshop Everland Sunset, and the jug on the back here of Brutogg's possessions with Skaven Blight tinge, and I now mixed in a little bit of Reap, a linen white, any white would do, with the Skaven Blight tinge to highlight it. And we're trying to smooth this highlight out a bit by adding more Skaven Blight tinge to our brush, and carefully, just quickly actually blending it together a little bit like that, and then adding just a little bit more white again. Until we get the look we want. Dragging the color back and forth and sort of mixing it on the actual jug. Also thinking I'll do like little tiny cracks in the, well, I'm assuming clay, to give it a bit more of an interesting look, like that. Maybe a little bit more of a white highlight there, and at the top and on the handle. Then like a few dots over here with pure linen white. It's like a glowing highlight, doing it like in little dots to suggest that it's got a sort of rough surface texture. We're then shading the Everland Sunset with a mix of Everland Sunset, Mornfang Brown, and a tiny bit of Corn Red. You can just use like any warm red. I just happen to, or warm brown color. I just don't happen to have the same or the exact hue that I wanted. Just so yeah, then we're highlighting the yellow cloth with thin lines of Ushabti bone or Vallejo bone white if you prefer. Either works fine. We want to hit the creases, like the tops of the creases, like this. And pick out little rivets and stuff in silver color, and then do a base, because I'm not doing the tattoo that Games Workshop did on Brutogg. Oh, and I painted the sword scabbards and the handles, hilts, the same color as the jacket. I almost forgot the gemstone. So many tiny little details. Anyway, let's paint it Sota green, because why not? I mean, I love turquoise. and it contrasts pretty well with the gold, and yeah. I really just realized that I'd forgotten to paint the gemstone, and what paint should I use? I'll go with turquoise. Not a lot of thought behind it. Anyway, there are really good like picture tutorials on how to paint gemstones. I'm basically just painting it turquoise and then adding thinner and thinner crescents of brighter and brighter turquoise with like just more white mixed into it. Like that. Then you paint black oval like this. It should be in the same direction as the light comes, like the upper part should be black if the light comes from above. And then, oops, with some white you paint like a little reflective, a little dot like that. I made it too big, but there we go. Looks like a gemstone. And you can gloss varnish it if you want to. There we go.